Welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today. If you're the kind of person who loves peeling back the layers to really understand how power works, you are definitely in the right place. Today, we're putting on our researcher hats to analyze a massive, structural failure of colonial power. We're going to examine one single piece of legislation that completely changed the course of history. We're looking at the Rowlatt Act of 1919. It was a law meant to crush a movement, but instead, well, it acted like a giant pressure cooker that forged a unified nation. Think about this for a second. How does the British Empire's most ruthless attempt to maintain control in India accidentally become the exact catalyst that unites the masses against them? As a researcher analyzing colonial power structures, I find this to be the ultimate paradox. The British wanted to tighten their grip, right? But their methods were so incredibly extreme that they literally destroyed their own legitimacy in the process. We're going to look really deeply at how this one piece of legislation structurally transformed India's independence movement from polite, elite debates into an absolutely unstoppable mass struggle. Section 1. The Architecture of Imperial Fear. So to really understand how we got there, we've got to rewind a bit and look at the massive, tragic clash of expectations at the end of the First World War. During the war, India remained incredibly loyal to the British Crown. They contributed over 1 million soldiers and vast economic resources to the Allied cause. So naturally, the Indian expectation was that these huge wartime sacrifices would be rewarded with post-war political autonomy and constitutional reform. It makes sense, right? But the British reality was driven by this deep, deep imperial anxiety. They were terrified of rising nationalist sentiment and sedition. So instead of granting freedom, the colonial administration decided to just extend their strict wartime emergency powers right into peacetime.
Section 2. Anatomy of the Black Act.
All right, let's dive into this and break down the brutal realities of the Anarchical and Revolutionary Crimes Act of 1919. It was officially passed on March 21st, despite, and this is wild, unanimous opposition from every single Indian member of the Imperial Legislative Council. This act authorized the government to arrest anyone suspected of terrorist activities without a warrant. It allowed for detention of up to 2 years without a single trial. It gave the police power to search places freely, placed severe restrictions on the freedom of the press, and even sanctioned in camera, meaning secret trials without juries.
Now, what's truly profound here is exactly which foundational human right got stripped away. Habeas corpus. It's the absolute cornerstone of English common law. It's the legal defense that lets a prisoner challenge unlawful confinement, and the Rowlatt Act entirely suspended it. By doing so, it allowed the government to just make people disappear into prison cells without ever having to prove a case against them in a fair court. It totally blurred the line between the law and just sheer executive willpower. By removing these protections, the colonial government wasn't just maintaining order, they were fundamentally dismantling the rule of law.
Section 3. Dismantling the rule of law.
The Rowlatt Act essentially set up this stark, two-tiered legal system. You had British nationals back home enjoying full civil liberties and the protection of habeas corpus, but Indian subjects living under the exact same British crown were subjected to arbitrary detention and secret trials. This glaring racial double standard proved that the act wasn't actually about law and order like the British claimed. No, it was entirely about retaining imperial power and stifling the rising movement for self-rule.
Section 4. The catalyst for mass mobilization.
But here's the thing, the British miscalculated terribly. Instead of silencing the population, this extreme repression accidentally triggered a massive, explosive chain reaction. The act is enacted on March 21st, and the outrage is immediate. Mahatma Gandhi, who up to this point had actually advocated for moderate reform, views this as a black law. He initiates a nationwide Hartal, a general strike, on April 6th, based on Satyagraha, or nonviolent resistance. This was the very first attempt at an all-India protest. And just days later, the colonial government's sheer panic over this mass resistance culminates in the horrific events of April 13th.
Section 5. The Amritsar Tragedy. The consequences of the colonial government's paranoia became tragically evident in the city of Amritsar. A massive crowd had assembled at Jallianwala Bagh to peacefully protest the arrest of local leaders and the imposition of martial law. British troops, commanded by Brigadier General Reginald Dyer, entered the enclosed area and, without any warning whatsoever, opened fire on the unarmed gathering. Hundreds of men, women, and children were killed, and over 1,000 were wounded. It was a completely horrific display of colonial authoritarianism.
And this next point starkly illustrates the twisted logic of the colonial power structure. When asked to justify the massacre, General Dyer actually stated that it was necessary to produce a moral effect. I mean, let that sink in. He wasn't trying to disperse a crowd, he was trying to terrorize an entire nation into submission. He wanted to show exactly how far the colonial state would go to maintain control. But instead of producing submission, this brutal act shocked the world and forever extinguished any lingering faith Indians had in British justice.
Section 6. Birth of a Unified Resistance.
So the crucial takeaway for us is this massive pre- and post-1919 paradigm shift. Before 1919, the Indian independence movement was mostly dominated by constitutionalists, elites and lawyers drafting polite petitions and making legal arguments for reform. But post-1919, because the Rowlatt Act proved that constitutional remedies were totally useless against a government willing to just suspend the rule of law entirely, the movement transformed. It became a broad-based mass struggle that relied on real grassroots support, nationwide strikes, and nonviolent civil disobedience.
The illusion of British benevolence was totally shattered. The moderate politicians who argued for cooperation were completely discredited. Prominent figures began taking really powerful symbolic stands. Actually, the great poet Rabindranath Tagore famously returned his knighthood in protest of the Amritsar massacre. The distance between the rulers and the ruled became permanently ingrained. The colonial government had lost its legitimacy, and they were never going to get it back.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought to conclude our explainer today. Can the ultimate tool of colonial oppression actually be the very thing that sets a nation free? By trying to legally enforce total control, the British Empire inadvertently created the mass, unified, nonviolent resistance that would eventually dismantle the rule entirely. It's a profound structural irony that reminds us how power, when pushed to its absolute extreme, often architects its own downfall. Thank you so much for joining me today to unpack this crucial piece of history. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.